Luther Harlan had spent 34 years making his life as quiet as a tombstone. Up on his mountain, the only sounds were the wind and his own heartbeat. He'd built a fortress of solitude out of pine logs and stubbornness, a place where trouble couldn't find him. He was wrong. Trouble didn't need a map. It just needed a name. And its name was Clementine Rock. She was the last one off the evening stagecoach. Not some wilting flower looking for a husband. No. The way she scanned the platform, her eyes sharp as newly chipped flint, told Luther everything. She wasn't looking for a home. She was looking for an escape route. His sister Belle had done this. Cooked up a mail-order bride scheme without so much as a buy your leave. "You're living like a ghost," she'd said. Belle had no idea what kind of ghost was about to step into his life. Clementine walked right up to him, her worn satchel in hand. There was no hesitation, no shyness, just a straight spine and a look that could peel bark off a tree. "You must be Luther Harlan," she said. It wasn't a question, it was an assessment. "I'm Clementine Rock, your bride." He just stood there, hat in hand, a big, dumb mountain of a man caught in a storm he never saw coming. She looked him up and down, not like a woman sizing up her future, but like a carpenter checking a support beam for cracks. "You're bigger than I expected. That's good. You look like you can handle yourself." Handle himself? He'd handled bears, blizzards, and the kind of loneliness that would drive most men mad. But he had a feeling he'd never handled anything like Clementine Rock, and that's when he saw it. As the wagon jolted on the trail up to his cabin, her satchel popped open for just a second. He wasn't expecting lace and letters, but he wasn't expecting what he saw either. Tightly wrapped bundles of herbs, sure, but also a small, heavy-looking pistol, its metal grip worn smooth from use. She snapped the bag shut, her eyes daring him to ask. He didn't. He just kept driving the wagon, the silence between them suddenly a lot heavier than it was a minute ago. This wasn't a woman running from a broken heart or a poor farm. This was a woman running from something that carried a gun. The cabin came into view, and her expert gaze swept over it, missing nothing. "It's smaller than I pictured," she said. "It's big enough for me," he grunted. "It was big enough for you," she corrected, her voice edged with steel. "Now there are two of us." Inside, her eyes landed on the single, narrow bed in the corner, separated from the main room by a threadbare curtain. "Where do I sleep?" The question wasn't about comfort. It was a line being drawn in the dirt. He told her he'd make a bed by the fire. "For how long?" she pressed. This wasn't a marriage. It was a negotiation, a contract. "I didn't come here for romance," she stated, setting her satchel down with a definitive thud. "I came here because I needed a new place to live, and marriage was the fastest way to get one. I will cook. I will clean. I will earn my keep. In return, I expect shelter and protection. Nothing more." It should have been a relief. A simple, clean arrangement. But as Luther looked at this woman, with her sharp eyes and the hidden pistol in her bag, he knew it was anything but simple. Protection from what? What in God's name had followed her all the way from Missouri to his remote corner of Montana? "What are you running from?" he asked, his voice low. A shudder came down in her eyes, so fast it was like a hawk snatching a mouse. "Nothing that will find me here," she said, her tone clipped and final. She turned away, effectively ending the conversation, and began inspecting his kitchen shelves. "This is a mess. We'll need supplies, real supplies." She was taking over, not just his kitchen, but his life. His entire carefully constructed world of silence and solitude was being invaded by a woman who organized his pantry like a general planning a campaign. He watched her, a mix of resentment and fascination churning in his gut. That night, as he lay in his bedroll by the fire, listening to her breathe on the other side of the curtain, he couldn't shake the image of that pistol. He had built his home to keep the world out, but he'd just invited the most dangerous part of it right inside. The first week was a war fought over coffee tins and tool sheds. Clementine moved through his cabin like a whirlwind, reorganizing, cleaning, and improving everything she touched. She declared his way of living uncivilized and set about fixing it with a terrifying efficiency. Luther fought back with silence, his jaw set so tight he was surprised his teeth didn't crack. "You're irritated," she said one morning, sliding a plate of perfect flapjacks in front of him. They were the best he'd ever eaten. "It's edible," he grumbled. Her laugh was a sharp, surprising sound. "Such high praise. Maybe you should have married a man who eats jerky for breakfast." "Maybe I should have," she shot back, her green eyes flashing. "But I didn't. I married you. We're stuck with each other." Stuck. The word landed like a stone in his gut. He finished his meal and headed for his trap lines, needing the familiar quiet of the woods to clear his head. But even there, he couldn't escape her. Who was this woman? Educated, you could tell by her speech. But her hands, while soft, knew how to work. Her clothes were mended with the precision of a surgeon, suggesting she knew hardship. She was a walking contradiction, a puzzle he couldn't solve. When he returned that evening, the cabin was different. Warmer. She'd hung curtains. Actual curtains. Dinner was on the table. A venison stew that smelled so good it made his mouth water. And she'd churned butter. "Where did the milk come from?" he asked, suspicious. "I walked over to Abner Pike's place," she said, not looking at him. "Traded some mending for milk and eggs. He's a nice man. Lonely. His wife passed last spring." A hot spike of something he didn't want to name shot through him. "You went alone?" "I'm not helpless, Luther. It's not safe wandering these mountains." "I followed the path," she said calmly. "Abner said you never visit. He invited us for Sunday dinner. I accepted." His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "You what?" "Your hermit days are over, Luther," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We're a unit now. We act like one." The argument that followed was the first real fire between them. He told her he didn't need a wife rearranging his social life. She told him hiding from his neighbors wasn't living. It was cowardly. The word hit him like a punch. No one had ever called him a coward. He'd faced down things that would make most men run for the hills. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He took a step toward her, his shadow falling over her. She held her ground, but for the first time, he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes before she stamped it out. "You don't know me," he said, his voice a low growl. "Don't I?" she challenged, standing to meet him. "A man so afraid of the world he has his sister pick out his wife? A man who won't even comfort a grieving neighbor? What else would you call it?" Something inside him snapped. He was close enough now to see the pulse hammering in her throat, to smell the lavender soap she used. He felt a raw, unfamiliar urge to either shake her or kiss her. He wasn't sure which. "I call it minding my own business," he snarled. "Well, this is my business now," she retorted, her voice shaking just a little. "And I refuse to be a prisoner in this cabin just because you're too scared to live." "Prisoner!" The word hung in the air, echoing his own thoughts about her being trapped. He looked at her then, really looked at her. She wasn't just fighting him. She was fighting for her own survival, for a life that was more than just four walls and a silent man. He slowly sat back down, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a grudging respect. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "I know," she said, her voice softening. "That's the problem." Later that night, as he lay by the fire, he realized the truth. He wasn't afraid of the world. He was afraid of her. Afraid of the way she saw right through him, the way she was systematically dismantling the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. And he was terrified that once those walls were gone, he wouldn't know who he was anymore. He was even more terrified that he might like the man he became. The tension between them shifted after that fight. It was still there, a low hum beneath the surface of their days. But it was different. A strange dance of observation and adaptation began. He found himself watching her, admiring the grace in her efficient movements. She, in turn, started anticipating his needs, leaving hot coffee for him when he came in from the cold, preparing a liniment for his aching shoulder without being asked. They were learning each other's rhythms, two solitary creatures circling one another, trying to figure out if the other was friend or foe. The first crack in his defenses came when she announced she was going to town. Alone. "No," he said, the word coming out faster and harder than he intended. "I wasn't asking permission," she replied, packing eggs into a basket. "I need supplies, proper flour, spices. I'm not waiting for you." "You're not going alone." "Why not?" "Afraid of the bears?" she mocked. It wasn't bears he was worried about. It was the thought of her in town, talking to people, charming them the way he'd seen her try to charm him. It was the gut-twisting fear that she'd get on the next stagecoach out of town and never look back. He couldn't say that, of course. Pride wouldn't let him. "People will talk," he said instead. "A woman alone." "You're worried about my reputation?" she asked, a hint of surprise in her voice. "I'm worried about yours," he lied. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment he thought she could see the truth clear as day, the fear in his eyes, the desperation. "That's considerate of you, Luther, but I can handle gossip." "I'll take you," he said, his voice rough. "If you're determined to go, I'll take you." The trip to Copper Falls was an education. The town was a cramped, noisy place he usually avoided, but Clementine moved through it like she owned it. In the general store, she didn't just buy supplies. She performed. She charmed the owner, Otis McCall, asking about his family, complimenting his stock. She negotiated prices with a skill that left Luther speechless. She was building relationships, gathering information, creating a network. This wasn't a shopping trip. It was a strategic operation. "Your wife's a treasure," Otis told Luther as they loaded the wagon. "Smart as a whip." Luther just nodded, the word treasure echoing in his head. He'd thought of her as a storm, a disruption, but watching her, he started to see her as something else, something valuable, something he was terrified of losing. On the ride home, she was quiet. "Regrets?" he asked. "About what?" "Seeing what you're missing. Civilization." She looked at the vast, empty mountains surrounding them. "I miss some things," she admitted. "But I don't regret coming here. Not yet." "What would make you regret it?" he pushed. She turned on the wagon seat to face him, her green eyes intense. "Feeling useless. Feeling like I was becoming smaller. I need to build something, Luther. Not just keep your house. Something that matters." That night she sat by the fire, making lists, supplies, improvements, and a list of everyone she'd met in town, with notes about their businesses, their families, their complaints. It was an intelligence report. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Planning," she said, her pencil scratching furiously. "You've built a good foundation here, but there's so much more potential. Your furs could fetch a higher price if prepared properly. The women in town need a reliable source for butter and cheese. This homestead, it could be an enterprise." The old resistance flared in him. "I trap enough for my needs." She sighed, putting down her pencil. "My husband, James," she began, her voice suddenly devoid of its usual fire. "He was a banker's son in Missouri, respected. He was also a gambler and a drunk who left me with nothing but debt and shame when he died." She looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not just running from debt, Luther. I'm running from a life of getting smaller every day. I came here to grow something, and I will, with or without your help." And that was the moment he understood. She wasn't trying to change him. She was trying to save herself. The very next day, he found himself driving her to Ellen Rigsby's boarding house. Clementine had heard the old woman's hands were too swollen with arthritis to handle the mountains of laundry. She offered to help, not for charity, but as a business proposition. 50 cents a day, plus meals. She's a godsend, Ellen told Luther, her eyes filled with grateful tears. You're a fortunate man. He was starting to believe it. On the ride home, a new, comfortable silence settled between them. Thank you, Clementine said softly. For what? For not fighting me on this. I still don't like it, he admitted. I know, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. But you did it anyway. That means something. That night, she cooked a feast. Roast chicken, stuffing, apple pie. It felt like a celebration. After dinner, she pulled out a bottle of good whiskey. To mark the occasion, she said. What occasion? The beginning of our partnership, she declared, raising her glass. He touched his glass to hers, the little clink sounding like a turning point. Partnership. It was a word he'd never associated with another living soul. But as he looked at Clementine, her face glowing in the firelight, her usual defensive sharpness softened into something hopeful, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. It was a dangerous feeling. It felt like coming home. He realized he wasn't just building a business with this woman. He was building a life. And that thought, which should have been a comfort, terrified him more than anything. Because the more he had to lose. Their partnership solidified over the next few weeks. He'd find her poring over books she'd ordered from back east, books about advanced tanning techniques and animal husbandry. She wasn't just washing laundry anymore. She was teaching some of the miners' children to read, mending clothes, and dispensing herbal remedies her mother had taught her. She was weaving herself into the fabric of the community, becoming indispensable. The sharp-edged woman from the stagecoach was transforming. There was a warmth to her now, a genuine care for the people she helped, and Luther found that warmth chipping away at the ice around his own heart. The final wall came crashing down on a cold October evening. He came home from his trap lines to the smell of cinnamon rolls. Ellen's birthday is tomorrow, Clementine explained, her face flushed from the oven's heat. I made a few extra for us. She had a smudge of flour on her cheek. Without thinking, he stepped forward and brushed it away with his thumb. The touch was electric. The world seemed to stop. She went completely still, her wide green eyes locked on his. His hand lingered on her soft skin, and he felt her lean into his touch, just slightly. The air crackled. The tension that had been simmering between them for weeks, the arguments, the negotiations, the shared work, it all coalesced into this one silent moment. Luther, she whispered, and his name sounded different, vulnerable. Clementine, he replied, his voice rough. He was going to kiss her. He knew it, and she knew it. It felt inevitable, like the coming winter. Then the door burst open. Abner Pike stumbled in, his face a mask of panic. Luther! Thank God! It's my boy, Tommy! He fell through the ice on the pond. He's alive, but he's so cold. Clementine, please. I don't know what to do. The moment shattered, but in its place, something new clicked into place. Before Luther could even process the words, Clementine was in motion. She grabbed her satchel, the one with the hidden pistol, and pulled out not a weapon, but neatly organized medical supplies. Of course I'll come, she said, her voice calm and authoritative. Luther, hitch the wagon, now! The trip to Abner's was a blur of frantic speed. They found young Tommy wrapped in every blanket in the house, shivering so violently it looked like he might break. His lips were blue. A deadly gray pallor lay under his skin. Luther's blood ran cold, but Clementine was a rock. She took command, her voice sharp and clear, issuing orders with the confidence of a seasoned field medic. She sent Abner to heat stones. She had Luther build the fire up to a roaring blaze. For 4 hours, she worked tirelessly, using every trick she knew to slowly, carefully bring the boy's temperature back from the brink. Luther worked alongside her, a silent, steady presence, fetching and carrying, his movements perfectly in sync with hers. They weren't husband and wife, they were a team. Well past midnight, Tommy's shivering finally stopped. Color returned to his cheeks. "He'll be fine," Clementine announced, slumping into a chair, the exhaustion finally hitting her. Abner wept with relief, thanking them over and over. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. The space between them was filled with a new, profound understanding. They had faced down death together and won. "Where did you learn all that?" he asked, his voice full of awe. "My mother," she said, her voice tired. "She was the closest thing our town had to a doctor. I was her apprentice." Back at their cabin, they sat by the fire, eating the cold cinnamon rolls. He looked at her, this incredible multi-layered woman, and felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost buckled him. "I'm glad you're here," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "I'm glad Belle was such a meddling fool." A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, reaching all the way to her eyes. "I'm glad too, Luther." That simple admission was more intimate than the kiss they almost shared. He knew in that moment that he was lost. He was in love with his mail-order bride, and with that love came a fear colder and deeper than any Montana winter. The first heavy snow of winter fell, sealing them in their mountain sanctuary. But it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a haven. The isolation that had once been Luther's comfort now became the crucible in which their partnership was forged into something unbreakable. With the outside world cut off, they turned inward, toward each other. The unspoken attraction that had been interrupted by Tommy's accident was a constant, living presence in the small cabin. One night, as a blizzard howled outside, Clementine looked up from her mending, her face serious in the firelight. "I have to tell you the truth, Luther. The real truth." A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. "I lied to you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About my husband, James." He waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "He didn't die in a riding accident." She took a deep breath, her eyes locked on the flames. "He was shot, murdered, by his business partner, a man named Elias Thorne." The name sounded like a death knell in the quiet room. "James wasn't just a gambler," she continued, the words spilling out now. "He was a cheat. He and Thorne were running crooked land deals, swindling families out of their savings. James got greedy. He tried to double-cross Thorne. Thorne found out." Luther felt the floor drop out from under him. This was darker than anything he had imagined. "Thorne was a powerful man in our county, respected. He came to our house that night. They argued. I was in the other room and heard everything. I heard the gunshot." Her body trembled with the memory. "When I ran in, James was dead on the floor. And Thorne, he looked at me, and he said, 'Your husband had an affair. He was shot by a jealous husband.' That's the story. If you ever say otherwise, you'll end up in the ground, right next to him." The sheer cold-blooded evil of it stole Luther's breath. "So you ran," he said, his voice hoarse. "I ran," she confirmed, finally looking at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Thorne owns the sheriff, the judge, everyone. There was no one to turn to. He took everything, leaving me with James's debts to make the story look real. I wasn't just escaping shame, Luther. I was running for my life. Thorne is not a man who leaves loose ends." And that's when he understood the pistol, the hyper-vigilance, the constant planning. She wasn't just building a business, she was building a fortress. She was preparing for the day Elias Thorne came to finish the job. "And your plan?" he asked softly. "To leave me?" She nodded, shamefaced. "My original plan was to use this marriage to get a foothold somewhere new, then disappear. Start over where he could never find me." "What changed?" "You," she said simply. "You're decent. You're honest. You're the only man I've ever met who is exactly who he appears to be. I started to feel safe here." Her voice broke on the last word. And then I realized I hadn't just found a safe place. I had found a home. If you'll still have me, knowing I brought this danger to your door. He looked at this woman, so strong and yet so vulnerable, who had survived hell and was still fighting. The fear he felt wasn't for himself. It was for her. A fierce protective rage surged through him, a rage directed at the monster who had haunted her for so long. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. "He will never touch you," he said, his voice a low, iron promise. "This is your home now, our home, and I will burn the world to the ground before I let him harm you." Relief washed over her face, so profound it was heartbreaking. He leaned in and finally kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of tentative discovery. It was a kiss of sealing a vow, of 2 people clinging to each other in a storm. It was raw and desperate, and full of a love that had been forged in conflict and confession. He swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed behind the curtain. That night, they didn't just become husband and wife. They became allies in a war he hadn't even known they were fighting. The rest of the winter was a blur of passion and planning. Every pelt he skinned, every dollar she earned, went into their war chest. They weren't just saving for a future with cattle and a bigger house. They were saving for a fight. Luther taught her to shoot the pistol she'd brought, and to his surprise, she was already a natural. She taught him about bookkeeping and strategy. They were 2 generals planning a campaign. Spring arrived, and with it, a new urgency. The melting snow felt like a ticking clock. When would Thorne discover where she was? The "if" had long since been replaced by "when." Then one afternoon, Clementine met him on the porch, her face pale, but her eyes shining with a fierce new light. "Luther," she said, her voice steady, "our timeline has changed." "What is it?" he asked, his hand instinctively going to the knife on his belt. "I'm pregnant." The world tilted on its axis. A child, their child, a future he'd never dared to dream of was suddenly real, tangible, and terrifyingly fragile. Joy warred with a primal fear. A child was hope. A child was life. A child was also a weakness, a target. "Good," he said, pulling her into his arms, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Then we'd better work faster." Their preparations became feverish. They bought their first head of cattle, using the profits from their exceptionally well-prepared furs. Clementine's business classes for the other trappers' wives had done more than bring in money. They had made her a respected and beloved figure in the community. She had built a network of loyal friends. Luther, the former hermit, found himself welcomed and respected as her husband. They were the Harlans. They were a force. But the shadow of Elias Thorne loomed over everything. Every stranger who rode into town, every unfamiliar face at the general store, sent a jolt of anxiety through them. They were building a beautiful life, a paradise on their mountain, but the serpent was always coiled just out of sight. The warning came from Otis McCall at the general store. It was late summer, the air thick and heavy. "Luther, Clementine," he said, pulling them aside, his face grim. "A man was in here yesterday from Missouri asking questions." The blood drained from Clementine's face. "What kind of questions?" Luther asked, his voice deadly calm. "Asked if there was a woman named Clementine who'd settled in the area. Described her perfectly. Said he was an old family friend." Otis leaned closer. "He didn't feel like a friend, Luther. He had cold eyes, the kind you see on a snake. He was here, or at least, his man was." The serpent had found their garden. They raced the wagon home, a silent, terrifying dread filling the space between them. For the first time, Luther saw true fear in his wife's eyes, not the defiant fear he'd seen when she stood up to him, but the deep, soul-chilling terror of a cornered animal. "He can't have us, Clementine," Luther said, his knuckles white on the reins. "He can't have our child." That night, they didn't sleep. Luther sat in a chair by the door, his rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit trail. Clementine sat at the table, her pistol clean and loaded in front of her. They were waiting. The silence of the mountain, once his comfort, was now filled with menace. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sounded like an approaching footstep. The attack didn't come that night, or the next. The waiting was a special kind of torture. It frayed their nerves, stretched their resolve to the breaking point. The scout must have returned to Thorn, reporting what he'd found. Thorn would come himself. He was the kind of man who enjoyed his work. It was a week later when a lone rider appeared on the trail leading to their cabin. He wasn't the scout. This man was dressed in expensive tailored clothes that looked out of place in the rugged mountains. He rode a fine black horse and had an air of arrogant authority. Even from a distance, Luther knew. It was Elias Thorn. "Stay inside. Lock the door," Luther commanded, grabbing his rifle. "No," Clementine said, her voice shaking but firm. She stood in the doorway, her pregnant belly a prominent silhouette. Her pistol was in her hand. "He came for me. He'll face me. He'll face us." Thorn dismounted slowly, a cruel smirk on his face as he took in the scene. The prosperous homestead, the defiant woman, the mountain of a man standing beside her. "Clementine, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "You've done well for yourself. I almost feel bad about having to burn it all down." "It's over, Elias," Clementine said, her voice ringing with a strength Luther had never heard. "You have no power here." Thorn laughed, a genuinely amused sound. "My dear girl, I have all the power. I have the law in my pocket and enough money to buy this entire territory. You have a farmer with a rusty rifle. The math is not in your favor." He took a step forward. "Now, you can come with me quietly, and I'll let your husband live. We have some business to conclude." "The only business we have," Luther growled, raising his rifle, "is deciding where to bury your body." Thorn's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected this level of defiance. He'd expected a terrified woman and a backwoods fool he could easily intimidate. He was looking at something else entirely. "A brave speech," he sneered, reaching into his coat, "but talk is cheap." He never finished the sentence, because at that moment another sound filled the air, the sound of hoofbeats, not one horse, but dozens. They came pouring over the ridge. Abner Pike was in the lead, his hunting rifle held high. Behind him were the other trappers, miners, and homesteaders from the area. The husbands and sons of the women Clementine had helped, taught, and healed. They formed a silent, grim-faced semicircle behind Thorn, cutting off his escape. Otis McCall rode forward, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. "Seems the math has changed, Mr. Thorn," he said calmly. "Around here, we take care of our own. And Mrs. Harlan, she's one of us." Thorn stared at the ring of hostile faces, his own face a picture of disbelief and fury. He was trapped. The network Clementine had so carefully built, the community she had woven together with kindness and competence, had become her army. His money and influence meant nothing here. He was just one man against a mountain of angry neighbors. He looked from the armed men to Clementine, standing proud and fearless on her porch, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. He saw the man beside her, a man who looked like he could tear him in two with his bare hands. He saw the utter, complete ruin of his plan. For the first time in his life, Elias Thorn was powerless. He spat on the ground. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, the eyes of the entire community burning into his back. They watched until he was a tiny speck in the distance, swallowed by the vastness of the territory he had so arrogantly underestimated. A cheer went up from the assembled men. Abner Pike rode up to the porch, his face beaming. We heard from Otis he was coming for you. There was never any question we'd be here. Clementine, tears of relief streaming down her face, could only whisper, "Thank you." Luther put his arm around his wife, pulling her close, and looked out at the faces of his neighbors, his friends. He had spent his life hiding from the world, and in the end, the world had come to save him, to save them. He had wanted solitude, but Clementine had given him something infinitely better. She had given him a home, a community, a family. A few months later, on a crisp December morning, Clementine gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Belle, after the sister whose meddling had started it all. As Luther held his daughter for the first time, looking at her tiny, perfect face and her shock of dark hair, he knew a peace deeper than any solitude he had ever known. He looked over at Clementine, who was watching him with a tired, radiant smile. Their homestead was thriving, their future was secure, and the shadows of the past had been banished for good by the light of the community they had built. This fierce, brilliant woman had not just saved herself, she had saved him from a half-life of loneliness. She had taken his quiet, empty cabin and filled it with love, laughter, and the promise of a dynasty. The quiet mountain man had found his voice. The runaway bride had found her home. Together, they had faced down a monster and built an empire out of nothing but grit, wit, and a love as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. If you believe that the strongest fortresses are built with love and loyalty, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Because the story of the family who stood against an entire corrupt town will make you rethink everything you know about justice,